Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. The New York Times is reporting that the U.S. is escalating what it calls a secret war in Somalia against al-shabaab. The article reports that the U.S. became more involved in Somalia after 9/11 in order to go after al-Qaeda. But besides a brief mention of the Black Hawk Down incident, the New York Times report left out why the U.S. was there in Somalia in the first place in the early 1990s. Joining us now to give us a little bit more context than the New York Times gave us is Glen Ford. Glen is co-founder and executive editor of the Black Agenda Report and the author of The Big Lie, an analysis of U.S. media coverage of the Grenada invasion. Glen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for the invitation.
So, Glen, what is the context for the long-term U.S. involvement in Somalia?
Yeah, the New York Times calls this a shadow war, and that's one of those phrases that people like those at the Times use when they're talking about a conflict that they don't cover much. The United States has been trying to control events in Somalia since the early 90s when the Somali national government collapsed. And the U.S. tried to go in there with all 4 feet and a kind of window dressing of international support, but was driven out after its humiliation in that Black Hawk Down situation in 1993. But the U.S. never left Somalia. It continued to operate there through a succession of paid warlords. And it financed various warlords in various parts of the country, some of whom fought each other for a very, very long time, continuing the chaos in that country. That chaos did not cease until early 2006, when finally a grassroots Somali moderate Islamist organization called the Islamic Courts succeeded in defeating the warlords that were in the pay of the CIA and bringing a peace, a semblance of peace at least, to southern and central Somalia, including the capital of Mogadishu. That was not to the liking of the United States, and it was not to the liking of Ethiopia, Somalia's neighbor and its historic rival in that region. And so in December of 2006, the Ethiopians invaded, and they were backed by the air power and the sea power and land forces of the United States. In fact, it was reported that U.S. Special Operations troops were with the invading Ethiopian forces down to the company level. So this was a deeply joint U.S.-Ethiopian invasion of Somalia. That invasion succeeded in defeating the Islamic courts, but it continued with a resistance by a youth group which called itself the al-shabaab. The Ethiopians took very, very heavy casualties from the al-shabaab, who at that stage were certainly fighting as national resistance fighters against invaders. And the Ethiopians then partially withdrew. The United States then gathered regional forces from Kenya and Uganda, and it prompted the African Union to launch what is called an African Union peacekeeping mission to militarily go up against the al-shabaab and to back a Somali government that was handpicked by the United States and endorsed by what they call the international community, but that really means the United States and Europe. And it's the United States and Europe that, of course, pay for the African Union's peacekeeping mission in Somalia. The New York Times is dealing with the operations that have deepened in Somalia since. The United States now routinely brings in hundreds of special operations troops. It also has Marines on what looks like a permanent kind of presence in Somalia. One of the countries that's involved in the African Union occupation of Somalia is Djibouti, which is really just a French colony, a neighbor of Somalia, that serves as a base for the French and for the Americans. The base in Djibouti is what the Americans call their only permanent base in Africa. But in fact, the Americans have plenty of bases, and they have plenty of bases in Somalia. One of the interesting facts of the New York Times story is the report that U.S. Private military corporations, that is, corporate mercenaries, are training Somali soldiers in a northern part of the country called Puntland, which has broken away from Somalia. And if that is true, then the United States is encouraging the fragmentation of Somalia as well. Those troops that are trained in Puntland by U.S. military corporations are then given more training by U.S. Marines in Mogadishu. So this looks like a permanent U.S. presence in Somalia. It doesn't look like a shadow operation at all. Since hundreds of U.S. Special Forces ops are accompanying Somali forces and other African Union forces on operations, and that there is a steady drumbeat of U.S. Bombing attacks in support of that, we're looking at a major operation that looks much more like the early days of Vietnam than some kind of shadow war.
Right. And in the Times article, they also characterized the strategy in Somalia as emblematic of Obama's foreign policy in general. As we reach the closing months of his presidency, what is his legacy of the use of force and maintenance of this kind of stuff in the Middle East and also in Africa?
Well, I don't know if it's what some folks call mission creep or just a creeping mission. But what the United States has done under President Obama is bring in these various coordinated forces and have them operate under a blanket policy that Obama calls defensive. In other words, this occupation of Somalia, which is a classic occupation kind of operation, is described by the United States as a defensive operation, so that the United States has the right to claim the right to bring in its bombers and its personnel and operate freely in the country, even though it has declared no belligerency against that country. That is war on the cuff with a facade of legal legitimacy. And that is probably the model that the New York Times is talking about, a model that selects any part of the world, but especially Africa, for operations that the U.S. Calls illegal and defensive, but are really various stages of occupation, deep penetration, a never exiting U.S. military.
And Glenn, finally, this past weekend, 3 white men in Kansas were arrested for attempting to bomb an apartment complex where hundreds of Somali immigrants lived. Is this an example of how interventions abroad lead to domestic terrorism, as Reverend Wright said, chickens coming home to roost?
Yes, well, the United States has always had domestic terrorism. We call them lynchings, and there are some elements of the U.S. population that does not need any external stimulus in order to engage in that kind of domestic terrorism. I think maybe the question is, where do you send the domestic terrorists? Where is the internal Guantanamo for these kinds of people?
All right, Glenn, I thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.